Welcome back to the Global Business Report here on Arise News. Let's get through some of the headlines, of course, making the news, of course, in the business space. A whole lot to discuss. Of course, AstraZeneca buying Seattle-based Ososami, which, of course, is a vaccine maker in the United States to the tune of about $1.1 billion. So AstraZeneca is, of course, doubling up on the initial investment it made during the COVID pandemic. So that's the big news coming out from Tuesday, that this investment is going to be made. And, of course, Ososami has about 2 or 3 current vaccines that are in phase 2 or 3 trials that, if approved, is going to spark things in the space. So that's what we're seeing. Of course, they're competing with GSK and some other companies. So that's what we're seeing there with AstraZeneca. We roll on right through with other news. Of course, COP28, the draft deal that is still being worked out between the parties. We can see here that it was delayed by about 10 hours before publication. There are calls on the phase out versus the phase down of fossil fuels. That still has to be worked on. Climate proponents are saying that the draft is weak. And of course, OPEC plus nations who are on the other side of the coin, they're also saying that they're not going to support any language for phase out of fossil fuels. So that's what happened on COP28. We continue to roll on, of course, with more of our headlines. Google, of course, losing its lawsuit that brought forward by Epic Games, the maker of Fortnite. They, of course, this was a judge made this determination yesterday, saying that Google, of course, is responsible for essentially suppressing the competition that uses its Play Store for its apps. And also, there's also the issue of Epic Games complaining about what was initially a 30% cut that Google takes from subscription payments, and also a 15% cut to some degree from other app developers. So that, of course, Google, or rather Alphabet, parent of Google, they're saying that they will appeal this decision. So we'll see how that plays out there. Rolling on through more of our headlines. Hasbro, the big toy maker, saying it's going to cut its workforce by 20%. That comes out to about 1,100 workers, 1,100. If you take a quote from the CEO of Hasbro, he essentially was saying that the headwinds we saw through the first 9 months of the year have continued into the holiday and are likely to persist into 2024. So which is quite shocking, because people, you assume, will be buying toys this Christmas. And this reminds us of Spotify, which of course announced last week that it will be cutting 17% of its global workforce due to macroeconomic headwinds. There was also British American Tobacco. They also announced a £25 billion impairment charge. They said also macroeconomic headwinds as well. So we're seeing how that's how that's developing, with a number of companies either taking impairment charges or cutting their staff across the globe. We roll on through the headlines today. Inflation expectations, this is the big number that traders are going to be looking for. Headline expectation 3.1% for November in the United States. October was at 3.2%, so they're expecting a deceleration. Core is expected to stay in place at 4%. October was 4%. We'll see what those numbers are later today. That is going to influence, of course, these 3 individuals. The Federal Open Market Committee, which will be meeting and giving us their decision tomorrow. On Thursday, Christine Lagarde and the European Central Bank, Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, they'll be giving us their interest rate decisions as well. So that's what's going to be going on as far as the major central banks over in the West are concerned. UK unemployment coming in, this is 3 months to October, coming in at 4.2%. Forecast was for 4.2, bang on, and similar to what we saw prior to that. So that's what we're seeing as far as those figures are concerned. Let's now go to Arise business analyst Bode Ososami, who is in London. Bode, thank you so much for joining us, and good morning to you. What do you make of those UK numbers that we've gotten from the Office of National Statistics?
Lotus, and thanks for having me on the show. We had cooler than expected wage growth, which I think is the number that is drawing attention, which suggested a dovish monetary reaction. That led to a brief dip in the pound, although I can see the pound climbed back already. Average weekly earnings, if you include bonuses, rose by 7.2%, much slower than the 7.7%. Unemployment rate was largely unchanged at 4.2%. The number of payrolled employees also rose by 1.1% in November year on year, and by 4.1% if you compare to February 2022. The largest increase in terms of payrolled employees was in the health and the social work sector. According to the ONS director, that is Darren Morgan, the labor market figures little change in the numbers really. But I think that the issue is that annual growth in earnings, though it remains high in cash terms, we're seeing some signs that wage pressures might be easing overall, but also with inflation falling more quickly, pay continues to grow if you look at it in real terms. When the Bank of England meets on Thursday, cooling wage growth seals the expectation that the Bank of England will most likely hold on interest rates. But if you note that wage growth is still more than double the 3.5% they typically target to achieve the desired 2% inflation print, it's likely the BOE will keep the door open to further hikes dependent on the data and be silent or push back expectations for rate cuts next year. Some are saying it will be a hawkish hold. I think a data-dependent hold is a more accurate description of what we are likely to see on Thursday.
What a week. I can't wait. But I have to get your thoughts on COP28. You've been covering this. You've been analyzing what's been going on. You know, what are you seeing? What is your take on the outcome, the back and forth over the language and so on and so forth?
I'm not surprised at developments. I gather the language can still change. I understand it's still a draft statement. The dialogue, I think, is very healthy. It's very naive not to see that the world is in an economic war. And any resolution that puts any nation or bloc of nations at a financial disadvantage is going to be resisted. The oil producers and developing countries that are more dependent on fossil fuels and have far less fiscal space will of course refuse to commit fiscal suicide and already have their plates full dealing with rising poverty, huge infrastructure deficit, a massive debt overhang, and of course a very tepid economy just barely growing post-COVID. So the timing for agreeing to what may look like an expensive transition that adds to their fiscal pains is a bit of an understandable challenge. But we shouldn't write off COP28. Climate activists insist that carbon capture and similar technologies to reduce carbons from fossil fuels are distractions, that what we need to do is just phase out fossil fuels, which is also the position of the UN. The present wordings on fossil fuels are very weak. It gives the option to members to consider fossil fuel reduction as part of what they could do. And that's all that the Saudi and the oil exporters could agree to. But of course, we've got that reaction that it's unacceptable to the EU, and even the UN boss has come out to say that is not good enough. But we'll see what happens. The value chain for alternative fuels tends to favor developed countries who, for example, produce the batteries for EVs. So it's a bit of a steeper change for poorer countries, and of course OPEC oil producing countries are going to feel the pinch. So I'm not surprised. Climate activists are convinced they are fighting for the planet. But most of them come from richer economies where access to energy is taken for granted. And the developed economies were built on previous decades on coal and cheaper oil. So you can see why this is not an easy debate. But one win was a landmark deal that was agreed on the first day to get a fund up and running with over $80 billion of financial pledges to help developing countries pay for the losses and damages caused by increasingly extreme weather. But I think what we are seeing is good. The fact that there is tension is better than what we had last year when the oil exporters just looked from afar. They didn't participate at all in the conversations.
All right, thank you for the breakdown. But another thing you've been breaking down a lot has been big tech and all these antitrust suits. This is Google, well, Alphabet. Google being a subsidiary of Alphabet. What do you make of this ruling against Google by the judge over in the United States, with Epic Games on the other side?
Well, Epic is not suing for money. They're essentially suing on principle and to change Google's practice of charging 15% to 30% on digital transaction for using their store. But I think that the bottom line is that even though the Californian federal judge decided for Epic that Alphabet maintains a monopoly in its app stores, distribution and payments market and is milking that dominance unfairly, Google is pushing back in a statement that they will challenge change this verdict, saying that they're competing with the likes of the App Store, Apple Store, and they believe that competition is fair. My sense is we are going to get this kind of more alert regulations, especially on the issue of competition and the issue of privacy, on the issue of consumer rights. We are seeing far more aggressive regulatory pushback than we used to see, and big tech firms need to begin to factor this in their strategic actions to avoid this extended court battle, some of which they're definitely going to lose. But you can see that European Union is also moving very quickly with legislation to address some of these issues, and EPIC is also calling for the US to move as fast as the UK and the EU in addressing what they've called Apple and Google's strangleholds over smartphones.
Bode, just about a minute to go, are these tech firms basically victims of their own success? Are they victims of becoming too large and too big?
Well, my view is that they've had it too good for too long, especially in terms of competition, in terms of profitability, in terms of pricing, and they've really become extremely dominant. And you will be tempted, if you're a businessman, if I were in their shoes, I would use that dominance or that competitive advantage. And the consumer obviously is at a loss, and some of the smaller apps developers. But at the same time, we are seeing regulation becoming much more confident, becoming much more aware, and seeing that they can win one or two battles. So I think we're just seeing a changing dynamic as far as the power structures between these tech titans, the App Store and the regulators. And the dynamic is now favoring increasingly the smaller app stores and the regulators trying to bring the big tech under some kind of guardrails. But I definitely big tech they have the budget to fight some of these suits. To some extent, they expect it, but I think something has definitely changed in the regulatory mood, and they better pick that up and adjust.
Wage movements in the UK, COP28 updates, big tech versus regulators. Arise business analyst Bode Ososami, thank you for breaking this all down, as you always do so well. We appreciate your time.